one of the main reasons I decided to move away from body composition focused work when I was only 18, 19, I think it was because I was sort of 4 years deep training. I'd spent
Yeah.
2 years really, really over indexing. 17, 18-year-old growing up in Scotland who took 6 months sober because he
Mm.
wanted to be as jacked as possible in Scotland.
Mm.
To
Yeah.
reiterate, that's very, very niche.
That's
And I
tough. Yeah.
decided that as I started to get leaner and leaner and leaner, my perception of myself started to get more and more skewed. And
Mm.
I decided that actually I was starting to get that psychological breakdown where I wasn't quite happy with the progress that I'd made, even though
Mm.
that's what I'd set out to do. And then I had a bit of a I moved into strength sports and then decided that if I was ever to sort of focus on just the lifting side of things, I think long term, the way my personality is,
Mm.
if it was ever just that complete chasing the next
Mm.
5 pounds of body weight at that body fat percentage, chasing the next 25 kilos in the bar without getting heavier, all this sort of stuff, I think that there was probably the reality for me was I probably would have started considering that sort of line of thinking, which is sort of why I've changed pace now, and it means that it can keep me focused on performance goals because performance goals are
Of
what
course.
get me buzzing, and I don't
Yeah.
really care how I look due to the nature of how I train. I'm in
Yeah.
decent shape, but I'm not sort of
Yeah.
mad jacked year round. That's something that would
Yeah.
probably help my YouTube channel, to be perfectly honest, if it was something to consider. But beyond that,
Yeah.
it's not something that I'm fussed about, which is good for my mental health. But going
Mm.
back to the psychological element, now that you've detached from bodybuilding as a formal discipline, you've
Yeah.
mentioned that the psychological effect that coming off cycle for the people that you speak to on a day-to-day basis, losing that size, losing that recovery, losing all the benefits, quote
Yeah.
unquote, that come from being on cycle.
Yeah.
How have you managed to process all that?
But it's as you mentioned, now it's become sort of performance based, and I'm not my I've shifted from looking into the mirror and going, oh, my delts need improving, to of let me try and beat this 50-meter butterfly. So the that change has been absolutely fine. It's been welcomed with open arms because I'm not. I still take great pride in my appearance, and it's weird because I've booked Ibiza. I'm going with the boys in June. We've just started the challenge, so we're kind of all getting into condition together. So I'm still very excited to see what I can do with the conditioning in my body. And I think the reward when you are natural is so much more. I mean, it's almost like back in the day when I was slapping 20 kilos aside on a shoulder press or a bench press, I was getting sort of very little from it. Whereas now, the buzz I get from putting 2.5 kilos on a plate to do a pendlay row, I'm like, oh my god, well done. So it for me, I suppose because I was so unhappy toward the end. Any change was welcomed. It wasn't a case of me being really happy in bodybuilding and I love taking anabolics and I love the way I look and then changing. It was a case of like, I'm sick of this. I need something new. I need to get back into team sports. I need to fight. I need to swim, cycle. So it's not really impacted me psychologically too much. There's a very small, faint feeling of like, oh, I do miss that strength element, but then I'll take that on board and soak it in and go, right, well, we can still be strong as fuck naturally. Like let's do it. And then that knock on effect is obviously you get a lot more out of it. And sometimes when I'm in the podcast room with Josh and Joe and I'll look at the size of them and think, God, I'd love to. I remember feeling like that. I remember being 111, 112 kilos, but then they start talking about can't sleep because they got them app masks on and I can barely breathe or walk up the stairs. And I think, why would I want to look like that? You know what I mean? You put us all in a cage together and you could barely fight a 30-second round, or like, you know what I mean? There's so many different strains that I'm getting away from that now, that it's just, it's not affecting me too much. But I get that question a lot. How have you coped psychologically with the change? And I suppose I've been bodybuilding for 8, 9, 10 years. I've still got the base, the foundations. And when I do make switches to training volume, when I do start to get more condition, it's still under there. Like, it's not gone anywhere. It's just not as full and it's not as vascular. But I'm all right with that. It's not too much of a concern.
You're still in the top 0.1% of jacked individuals in the UK, I'd imagine, as well, which is probably easy to forget, again, in that echo chamber of the top end
Yeah.
bodybuilding that you've been in. I think that's often where it's easy to be hard on yourself. Do you think it's a young man's game? Do you think what you've come to is a maturity consideration, or just the fact that maybe long term bodybuilding wasn't right for you? Or do you think bodybuilding is a young man's game?
I think it's a young man's game, because I think you look at the old, and no disrespect to the older guys, but you look at those older generations of bodybuilders that still eat, sleep, and breathe, and you see them in the gym with their kind of 70s leather belt on, and you think, God, that is, how have you done that for so long? There's no, what excitement you getting from life, you know? So I definitely think it's a young man's game. I definitely think it's got a shelf life. And you look at the likes of kind of Chris Bumstead, and how he, even at his age now, like 24, 25, I think he's talking of like it's going to be his last Olympia soon. And I think when you see, especially in the day and age now of social media, and how much of a positive response that we get from avenues away from bodybuilding, you know, Chris being the sort of poster boy for classic, and people get more interested in, oh my God, he's on holiday wearing these shorts. It's like, well, you know, it's nice to, I suppose, dip your toe in for a few years, and then have an exit plan. I think would be my recommendation. You know, having that, you know, I'm gonna bodybuild for 3 or 4 years, but in that time. And I think the couple of boys that I'm with now, they're not coming toward the end, because I think they're both very, very focused on still being the best in the world. But you can kind of see that, right, I need to start thinking about what I'm doing after this, you know. And we're all the same, pretty much the same age. And I feel like I made the jump first, and then maybe they're looking a little bit at what I've done and going, oh, it can be done. You know, I think a lot of bodybuilders are scared because they've built their whole core value on being a bodybuilder. Whereas I don't think I was ever really Tom the bodybuilder, so it's been quite an easy step away for me.